Three, two, one. Hello, you're watching Deprogram with Ted Rall and Jamarl Thomas. Today, we're checking in on the latest from the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. There's been a lot of recent developments that everybody's following. It seems like there's a lot of conflicting reporting. So, in order to clarify things a little bit, we're bringing in Stanislav Krapivnik. My apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. He's a Russian-born military. Is that correct?
Close, close. Krapivnik. Even well, if you're into the Russian process, Krapivnik.
Krapivnik. Okay. He's a Russian-born military political analyst, former U.S. serviceman, now based in Russia, and geopolitical analyst. He does a Substack. He's a part-time journalist, wears a lot of hats, has worn a lot of hats, and we couldn't think of anyone better to talk to than him. So, joining us from Russia, thanks for joining Deprogram.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm the poster child for the career you start with is not probably the one you'll be doing halfway through your life before anywhere else. So, yeah, be
That
fun.
was certainly the case for me too. Yeah.
I'm just so proud about blogs right now.
So, so Stan, I was wondering if you could just bring us up to speed here in the United States. Obviously, we're getting a very pro-Ukraine, narrative in the media. I mean, it's sort of following up what's been going on for the entire length of the war, and before that, where basically, Russia is at fault and is losing consistently. Now it's like we're being told, well, now no, they're really actually losing, but there's been a lot of exchanges back and forth. Zelensky's government seems to be in facing somewhat of a crisis with domestic protests there. Can you tell us what's actually going on as far as you know?
Yeah, no problem. One thing, it's Stas, not Stan. No, everybody
It's
knows
us.
that,
Thank you.
obviously.
Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, I put out a video on my YouTube channel 2 days ago about the total fuel apocalypse. You know, Russia's absolutely dead in the water. Everything's collapsed. That's why I was able to drive 1,200 kilometers down. So yeah, it kind of cuts right through that Western BS. Look, is it harder with fuel? Yeah, it is. Is it any kind of catastrophe? No, and it's gotten much better over the last 3 weeks. The last time I drove up and down this area, when I went to the front line. Well, so I did go to the front lines this time. They wouldn't allow us there because what is going on is you got Thiel's Palantir terrorist drones flying around on autopilot. And those drones are programmed to go after military equipment for the first 80% of or something that looks like military equipment for the first 80% of their battery life. And the last 20% of battery life, they're just looking for anything that moves. So they have managed to kill quite a few civilians by hitting their cars, including yet today there was a motorcyclist that was killed. Last month they went after a 10, an 11, and a 12-year-old on a bicycle. I killed them. This is what you're dealing with. Palantir is a terrorist organization. Thiel is a terrorist. And that's as flat as you could say it. And the U.S. government is using a terrorist organization that targets civilians for murder. And that's part of the U.S. government's policies. The Ukraine does it. Ukraine's just a proxy of the U.S. government. So, of course, there's no big surprise in that. Having said that, you get out of the city. First of all, it's such a big lock of fuel that I think the traffic jams have gotten like 5 minutes shorter. Look, the traffic jams they're still there. You get out of the city, you get out of Moscow. I'll say probably, 3 weeks ago was 1 in 4 gas stations had fuel. Now I think it's 1 in 2. Yeah, sure, you may have to wait a bit for most of these lines, but there's another thing is this is the tourist season, so there's millions of people heading south for vacation. So you always have some amount of lines just because, and the mom and pops run out of fuel just because. There's always this mass migration. Now, having said that, packed in an extra 3 hours on a trip just in case in my planning, just in case for fuel lines, and I just in case, yeah, I didn't let my tank go lower than 3/4. So every time I got a quarter, I just re-topped it off. So I probably topped off a lot more than I would have on a normal situation. But overall, that wasn't a big problem finding fuel. Um, Lines for the most part, you may have had per pump, maybe like 5 cars on average per pump. So you're not talking giant lines. So yeah, we got down there. If, you can see the videos. I did the videos we're driving down. The other thing that they're now story they're telling everyone is that the crops are rotting in the fields because there's no diesel, which is why Russia is not exporting diesel. Well, except that Russia never exports diesel at this time of year to begin with. Starting in April and running through September, Russia doesn't export diesel because it all goes either to internal trucking or primarily it goes to agriculture. And since Russia is such a giant country, the in the south they'll start the planting season at the end of March. In the far north, and I think, by the way, in the south, they get two harvests at least out of most of these fields. And in the far north, the planting season starts around mid-May, late May. They get one season out, but it's intense because there's a lot of daylight, very short nights. But because that big difference, they don't. Russia doesn't export diesel during the warm months. They're almost mainly for agriculture. And in my videos, and in that video, you'll see harvesters, combines going down, collecting the first harvest of wheat, which is in, and sunflowers, which is in. And there'll be the first. What I'm saying is, you can see on the videos, you can see the combines working, and the crops being brought in. So the people will that count on Russia to feed them because Russia feeds a third of the world. They're not going to go hungry. As much as Europe is probably crying right now, but big chunks of Africa and Asia are not going to go hungry. Um, I mean, if just to understand, Egypt is alive because of Russian grain. Egypt is one of the biggest purchasers of Russian grain, and not only a lot of sub-Saharan Africa buys up Russian grain, Southeast Asia, and Russia also exports rice, not corn. Corn it makes just about enough for itself, but it's not a big as big a product as in the U.S. But rice, it exports. It's a huge rice producer. Wheat, buckwheat. All the different grains basically. Sugar beets. So it feeds, and that's not counting, meat, chicken, fish, and so on. So,
Gotcha. So
yes,
Jamal, you wanted to ask about the strikes.
mhm.
Yeah. So, has Russia, is it fair to say that, because there's been a lot of pressure from standpoint of the public saying they want Putin to be more aggressive, more basically prosecute the war. People on my channel, and even people on this channel, to make that point, very clear, right? Um, do you think that this is obviously there was a Wildberries attack? Basically, the Wildberries was kind of like an Amazon warehouse, basically a soft target. It wasn't a military target that Kiev effectively hit, and they wrapped this massive explosion out of it. Immediately, almost immediately after, overnight, we got what is being called the largest missile strike on Kiev, where about 50 or more missiles, including hypersonic, effectively leveled various elements of warehouses in Kiev. Is this a uptick? Meaning, are we looking at Russia prosecuting this war that much more, whether it's from Odessa or for that matter, whether it's the warehouses in Kiev? Is something different?
Now the strikes on the warehouses in the Wild Berries warehouses. Today's strikes aren't a retaliation for that, but these strikes get planned well in ahead of time. So I doubt that there's a retaliation. Now, having said that, considering the richest woman in the world just had two of her warehouses taken out, um, even if the Russian government doesn't want to hear the people who are screaming, burn, strike the European manufacturers and go ahead and escalate, uh, the government's going to be much harder to ignore when some of the richest people in the world go, maybe it's time to burn the Italian factories and the German factories, the British factories. Maybe it's time to really take the war home to the Europeans and let them feel a little pain. And I'm hoping that that's going to be heard. That's the only way to sober the Europeans up is to make them run around and scream in terror when things go boom. Just to understand, Russians, by the way, laying on the beach, and there's sirens. There's air raid sirens because there's drones incoming. Nobody moves. Everybody keeps laying on the beach and going to the beach. Drones fly by. Anti-aircraft systems kick in. You can hear the gunfire taking off. The civilians aren't running. This is Russians. You really can't phase Russians. Well, yeah, you remember when the Islamic jihadists of the Muslim Brotherhood had a little revolution in Egypt and took over? With the whole civil war going on?
Mm.
Well, all the Americans and Europeans ran away from those Egyptian resorts. The Russians stayed. Sherman Sheikh was one of those. The Russian tourists just stayed there. They didn't give a damn. The fighting's out there. Don't come in here. And the Islamics have figured out that's probably not worth going in there because those Russians will start fighting back. So we'll just ignore them and go ahead and take over. And then they just let everybody fly away. It's just easier that way. And that's the screw. This is, I mean, the most stark example I can bring you is Gorlovka. The pre-war population of Gorlovka was 380,000. I've been in Gorlovka multiple times. I've been down the road of death, which is the western edge of Gorlovka. Burned out cars all over from drone hit. I've been at bombed. I did a report at a bombed market. Thankfully, just had not opened yet, and the only victims were the people that were setting up shop. One guy's corpse was still laying behind me. Nobody's coming in to pick him up while there's still an artillery duel going back and forth. You walk around, you look at these apartment buildings, and they've been bombed, but they haven't been bombed by artillery. They get bombed with FPV drones. So what the Ukrainians will do is they'll fly up one of these FPV drones to the windows, look around, see if they see people in there, and then they slam the drone in and blow up the apartment to try to maximize civilian deaths. Gorlovka hasn't had water in 12 years because the Ukrainians keep hitting the stations. They used anti armor for bunker buster artillery rounds early on to destroy the water mains. Every time it gets repaired, they'll shoot it. They'll shoot up the rescue crews. So the pre-war population of Gorlovka was 380,000. The present population of Horlivka is 320,000. People just look at it and go, screw you, this is our land. We're not going anywhere. You can come in here and you can try to kill us off, but we're not going. That's the Russian mentality. So
Do you think
unlike what you'd see in Europe, where yes and no. At its essence, the central and eastern Ukrainians are Russians, and they are Russians. In the Western Ukrainians were once Russians. I mean, that was Russian territory. Galicia was Russian territory until about the 1400s. After that, the Poles were able to grab it, then the Hungarians and the Germans, and it's just a hodgepodge. So we're not going to count that. But the fact is, the Central and Eastern Ukrainians are Russians. They've been Ukrainized by the communists back in the 1920s. Huge mistake. Stalin stopped that Lenin-Trotskyite idiocy back in about 33, 34, when they figured out they just created a bunch of wannabe Nazis. That was not a very good policy to follow. But, we're still dealing with that little present that Lenin left us. Like I said, Stalin was smart enough to go and look at it and go, no, we're not going to do the same. But the damage is already done. Let me tell you, if you want to go, particularly in Yandex, if you do it in Russian, you write in Ukrainizatsiya 1920s and hit images, and you'll get tons of these scans of newspaper articles from the 1920s from the Soviets proclaiming the triumph of Ukrainization and forcing people to learn Ukrainian. There were riots in Kyiv when they were told, "Oh, you're not Russians, you're Ukrainians. You have to learn Ukrainian." Like, or what? What the hell is a Ukrainian? Number one, and why the hell do we have to learn Galician? Then that's not our language. They were quite literally riots from that the Bolsheviks put down. So they were creating this new nationalities, divide and rule, basically, is what they were doing. Uh, so that's why the fight is so hard, because we're basically fighting ourselves. But there is a difference too, because this Galician attitude has also come in, that's understood as Maya chata s kraya. My hut is at the edge. So the whole village can burn, and I don't give a damn until it gets to me. Then I give a damn. And that's a big mentality of why Ukraine was always going to be a failed state. Russia went through the same crap Ukraine went through in the 90s, got off its arse, washed the shit and the mud off, and started building a massive nation. Ukraine just kept wallowing like pigs in shit because that and I mean just to understand that by the numbers, Ukraine left the Soviet Union with an economy the size in 1991, with an economy the size, industrial economy and scientific economy the size of France. Zero debt, because Russia took all the debt of the Soviet Union onto itself as they inherited a nation. Ukraine, that was Ukraine 1991. In 2021, Ukraine was compared to Uganda. At which point, the president of Uganda came out and said, "Don't you dare compare us to these people. We live much better than they do." So, I mean, this is you're gonna the amount of just pillaging of industry is incredible. Everything was sold off multiple times. Sometimes, uh, it's like Trump's deal on rare earth resources. And those mines have been sold, I think, 3 or 4 times at this point. It's like the Brooklyn Bridge. Who else wants to buy it? Yeah, I'm sure we'll sell it to you again, no problem. That's Ukraine. Ukraine is a cesspool of corruption. It's a cesspool of Satanism, quite literally. It's a cesspool of just all the worst aspects of modern culture that you can throw in there. It's just that's what it is. It's absorbed everything, and if you're building society whose only foundation is we're anti-Russian, well, that's by the way, they also hate the Poles, and they hate the Hungarians, and they hate the Romanians, and they hate each other depending on what area they come from. When that's the foundation of your society, you're not going to have a successful society. You know, you got to have something a little more enlightening. What do you bring to your society? We just hate everybody. Well, not equally. Certainly we hate even more than other people, but it doesn't work. So that's. But at their core instinct, they are Russians, which, by the way, is something I've been talking about. Ukrainian ultranationalists are a very unique anomaly. If you listen to them talk, it's a very interesting anomaly of self-hatred. Okay, so difference quickly, nationalist and an ultranationalist. A nationalist wakes up and goes, I want every kid in the world to wake up and want to live in my country and be like us. That's a nationalist. Ultranationalist wakes up in the world and goes, everybody's scum except for us. We're the superior genetics, and I hope they all just bugger off. That's the ultranationalists. Well, the Ukrainians are an interesting bunch of ultranationalists because they actually hate their own race. If you listen to their ultranationalists, because at their core, they know they're Russians, and they hate Russians, so they hate themselves. And you listen to these guys, like there was a professor from, was it Kyiv Institute? When they're talking about bringing 40,000, 40,000 peacekeepers from the European Union. And quite literally, these guys are talking, boy, they're fucking in Russian too, so just when they like, we're going to get 40,000 men of better genetic quality. And they can all get they can breed the women, and they can get like 100,000 Ukrainian women pregnant. And the next generation is going to be a better quality, genetically better quality. And you realize, indeed, and this is just one example. There's a lot of, so you're looking at ultranationalists who, despite their own genetics, who hate themselves, they want to breed their people into something different. Now they're breeding Indians and Pakistanis. They're saying the same thing because, they're breeding them as workers. Look at this is unique. This is the only instance in the world where the ultranationalist wants to breed something out of his society, out of his people into something different because he hates his own bloodlines. so badly. So this is, but this is the society that you have in Ukraine. It's an insane asylum, quite literally. And by the way, but what's going on the front lines? Just to go down real quick. Um, because if you listen to Western media again, it has the Ukrainians are rolling the Russians back. They're just somewhere south of Moscow. Everybody's digging tank trenches, tank ditches, getting ready to defend Moscow. It's Barbarossa all over again. And then there's the reality. So since the end of last year to this half of this year, the Russian military has moved about 30 kilometers westward, and everyone will say, "Oh, that's not much." Well, when you consider that this is the most fortified territories in the world, the Donbass, it took the Soviet Union half a year to clear the Germans out. The Germans, the Nazis, the Germans, and all the other Europeans are and massive losses of life.
Basically, this is an extraordinarily fortified area, and it's taken a while to remove them, especially if you don't necessarily want to lose a huge amount of Russian lives.
Yeah, have you seen? I
And
mean, I'm sure you've seen the images of the Ukrainian fortifications. They're extensive. Yeah.
yeah, and you can even check the bodies that are being returned. It's like 1 to 32, if not more. Like, meaning it seems to be less Russians being killed, not more, in the way that Western media is talking about it. And not to mention, they're losing villages left and right. Like, this narrative of the Ukrainians are rolling the Russians back, I don't know where they're getting that from. And, like, you're looking at the ground and you're like, okay, well, they're being rolled back in Konstantinivka. Konstantinivka. God, I have such a hard time saying that word. They've lost Krasnodar. So it's like, okay, so you've effectively been surrounded. The Russians are surrounding Kramatorsk Sloviansk. That is the last stronghold. That doesn't look like success. That looks like your last stronghold.
No. Mm-mm.
So I don't know where they get that from. And it's amazing to me that they can make this stuff out of cold claw. And the media just runs with it.
Yeah, I mean,
Well,
it's crazy, right? I mean, I don't understand. I mean, even if you're not following this story closely, which I don't blame Americans for not, because it's been going on for so long and doesn't seem like there's really any huge changes. And you know how the American media is. If there's things aren't really blowing up in a big way, it's not exciting to them. But I don't get how people can look at the map and here's stars. Here we go.
But so yeah, I'll go. What we have here, the main battlefield right now is the Druzhovka Kramatorsk Slavinsk agglomeration, which is basically just one big city. So you have this, it's kind of C-shaped, and on one end you have Konstantinovka, on the other hand you have Krasny Liman, which is also taken. It's just being cleared now of pockets of resistance. Krasny Liman is on the high ground about 15 kilometers away from Slaviansk, and it's looking down on it. Historically, this is the way the Red Army cleared this area too, going downhill. Artillery's got longer range, it's firing down. The entire city's out on a flat, open area in front of you that you can look down on. So you've got pincers coming up on the main routes from north to south and south to north. Then you've got the frontal assault that's about 5 kilometers out and closing. It's the movement forward has been stopped to consolidate the different branches going forward and make one long line because there's pockets of Ukrainians that were surrounded. So they're going to start moving forward again. They're 5 kilometers out. So you've got pincher movements coming this way. You've got the front moving this way, and then there's another push. Where was I? Got this other push up from Dobropolye, which is coming up behind this fortification. Now, the key difference here is this is the last line of fortifications for the Ukrainians. So what we've had before is every city in the east that's fallen, they just move back to the next city that's been fortified. And the next city has been fortified. The next city has been fortified. And these cities may be 10, 15 kilometers apart from each other. It's not a very long run across open fields to get to the next fortified line that's being held. The problem for Ukrainians now is there are no more fortified lines. This is it. This is the last, and these fortifications are what they've been preparing since 2014, pouring untold amounts of concrete, rebar to concrete, putting in elevators for machine guns and mortar tubes, and so on and so on, building tunnels. But this is the last line. After that, it's open fields and small villages and some field fortifications, trenches that they've dug up that they can't hold. There is no more lines of fortifications all the way up to the Dnieper River. So they've got big problems. And the other thing is, Russia now has aerial control of the territory behind these fortifications, these 3 fortified cities. So when they try to bring in supplies or get the wounded out, they come under drone attack and they come under aviation bombardment and missile bombardment. And they'll make it even worse for them if they're still in there by the end of September, beginning of October, when the rains start. Those fields are going to turn into quagmires, and only hardened roads are the only way you're going to get through. So anybody that's still in there is going to have one of two choices: die in place or surrender. And that is just that's going to be the huge loss for Ukraine, because that is the final, actually heavily fortified area. The other areas right now, I guess start from north. Sumy, Russian forces are on the edges of Sumy. I'm thinking within in areas that are 3 to 5 kilometers out, which is basically the edge. It's a mile and a half. They more likely will start investing Sumy sometime in the next month or so. Sumy is a town of about 200,000 people. It's the key part about Sumy is it's a logistics hub. They've got major interstates and rail lines coming in from Chernihiv to the northwest, from Kyiv to the west. It's the route that was used to invade into Kursk province, because there's a road that goes up toward Kursk city. And it is the main logistics hub feeding Kharkiv to the southeast. So if you take Sumy, you basically cut off Kharkiv from the west. Kharkiv's cut off from the north. Kharkiv's cut off from the east. So the only thing you got left is the south. And I believe it's the Vulture River. The Vulture River runs in there. Or maybe the Donetsk River that runs through that area. But either way, there's bridges that have to be crossed in south of Kharkiv to get to Kharkiv. So you cannot start. You basically isolate Kharkiv, and then you're ready. You cut the bridges and you fully isolate the city. So that's the first step of that. Major isolations already been taken in the north and the east, and now the big step is going to be taken Sumy in the west. And Sumy is going to be very hard to defend for the Ukrainians. They're within the Russian artillery, aviation umbrella. They're within. It's basically the city is flat. It's open. I mean, there are points of that you can defend on, factories, things like that, but there's no topographical areas that lend to its defense. And then swing all the way back down to the south, you've got the battle for Orikhiv. Orikhiv is the last major fortified town southeast of Zaporozhye city. And that's being surrounded from 3 sides. And there's already fighting in the next adjacent village outside of Orikhiv. Russian soldiers are pushing up north, and that's Tamachka, I think. Let me check that real quick to be accurate. It got I'll tell you in 1 second. Come on, load up. Malaya Takmachka. And it runs almost to the edge of, it's a thin town, village along, the main interstate's N08. And that's the main feeder road for that. And that's being surrounded from 3 sides right now. And it's already it's not physically surrounded yet, but it's in a tactical encirclement, because the main road going in is fully under artillery and aviation and drone control. So you can't get anything in, can't get anything out. And once that's done, again, you'll have the same thing. You have a bunch of small villages, unfortified in any sense, right up to Zaporozhye city. So Ukrainians have a lot of problems. How fast this front collapses, we'll see. It's always hard to tell. I'm thinking the Kramatorsk area may collapse a lot faster because while the Ukrainians fought tooth and nail on the previous cities in front of it, they always knew they could always fall back. Things went bad. They always had an ability to fall back to the next line. Now there is no next line. There's just open fields. So the only place to fall back is to try to run across 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers of open fields. That's a lot of running. So with drones and aviation overhead. So, it's interesting too, because what you hear from these guys, those statements coming out of Ukraine from the military Minister of Defense, and this may be one of the reasons Fyodorov got fired, another really Ukrainian name, Fyodorov. Just to understand how bad this is, several Russian generals, key generals, are born in today's Ukraine. Sersky was born in today's Russia, and his father and his brother still live in Russia. So, this is a civil war, in any which way you look at it. One of the statements that came out was that their aim is 40 to 50% foreigners or mercenaries in the storm battalions. So they're running out of men. You don't look for foreigners to do your assaults if you have plenty of people. That's one of those things you don't do. But since they're actively having to do that and recruit that just tells you that they're running out of men.
Why did that general get fired? Like, why really?
Oh, the Minister of Defense?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, Minister of Defense is one of the best places to earn money. Easy example is Yemirov, who was Minister of Defense for 3 years. He's on the Security Council now. He and his entire family, and when I say entire family, I don't mean just him, his wife and kids, his parents, her parents, his brother, the brother's family, they all got American citizenship in 2016. His entire family, except for him, live in Florida. He spent 3 years as Minister of Defense during the first 3 years of conflict, charging, $50 for 10 eggs. Prices like that for the military. So he and his family have been buying up real estate left and right all over Miami. So that's one thing, is they steal like crazy. True, Zelenskyy gets a chunk of that, obviously. It's all a mafia state, and the big Don has to get a chunk from the sub-Dons and the sub-sub-Dons and so on. You pass it up to the big guy. But right now, Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian government is not quite all as unified as it may look, because while you have in Russian folklore or Eastern Slavic folklore, and maybe in Western Slavic too, I'm not sure. There's this dragon called Zmei Gorenich. The snake Gorenich is a three-headed dragon. In this case, the three-headed dragon is the CIA, MI6, and Mossad. And particularly, Zelenskyy is an animal of the Americans and the Israelis. And even though all three heads are connected to the same body, they kind of still, most of the time they're aiming in the same direction, but they still have their own quarrels internally. Who wants to be on the top? So the British obviously want to be able to control everything, rather than having the Americans control everything in Ukraine. Get the better cream off the top. So they've got Zelenskyy, and they keep pushing Zelenskyy. So you've already got internal issues because the British want their guy in. The Americans want to keep their guy in. We know that Trump is suddenly best friends with Zelenskyy. Look, anybody who believed that little hoopla in the White House in the beginning, that was real, shame on you. Go use your brain. This is all theater for the masses. To ever believe that Trump, that the U.S. deep state cannot control Zelenskyy, seriously? They could have him shot any day they wanted him. They've got full control over this guy. what you're seeing now is AstroTurf protests. These aren't grassroots. In fact, what was grassroots was Evolve. That was grassroots. And this is an interesting point. Why you don't quite see the same thing in other areas? Well, Evolve, you see, Ukrainians hate each other because they don't consider each other Ukrainians. So the further east you go, the further they look at everybody to the west of the further west you go, they look at everybody to the east of them as not real Ukrainians, but Russians. We're the only real Ukrainians. It's a ludicrous state. It's an artificial state, and the Lvov, they're the purest of the Ukrainians, except the Galicians think they're impure. So how dare you take us and we have to go fight and die? We're the special, really special people. It's those Russians in Dnipropetrovsk or in these other provinces in the area in Kyiv. They have to go die and fight beside, not us. So to them, this is a massive insult, and now being forced recruited to go fight. That's not supposed to happen. It's supposed to be the Russians fighting the Russians, not us being. So they're more emotionally now involved. But that protest got busted up, or that revolt got busted up pretty fast or pretty hard. The press gangs, they have ultra nationalist units that will never go fight because they're used as muscle. And they came in there and they beat the crap out of a lot of these people. They brought them in, made them apologize en masse, sent some of them to jail, but most of them are going to get press ganged up in front no matter what. That's what a real protest looks like in Ukraine. It doesn't last. It doesn't get financed. It's something that people start, and the government comes in there and kills a bunch of them or cracks a bunch of heads and sends them all off to die in the front in the meat grinder. That's a real protest in Ukraine. Now, having said that, what the hell is that just landed on my computer? 1 second. Oh, that's a big grasshopper. Oh, I'm being surrounded by bugs. That's a really big grasshopper that's on my screen now. So that's a real protest. What we're seeing now is AstroTurf. These are funded protests, more than likely funded by the British, to put pressure on Zelenskyy as they want their guy in. I mean, that's just as simple as it gets. This is all theater. This is all theater. I mean, look at how many young men are out there, and the press gangs aren't touching them. They're not touching them because they're paid not to touch them. These guys have, these are professional protesters. They come out when they're needed. So there's a whole class of men that lower their front because they have immunity because they're professional protests and they're on the payroll of one of the government. One of the governments backing the Ukrainian. It's ludicrous as it gets, but this is Ukraine.
Wow.
Any other questions, Jamaro?
No, this was good. I appreciate Stas coming on too, especially with the signal fighting through it. No, I appreciate staying on.
Thank you very much, Stas.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, take care. That was
Yep.
the voice of an image of Stanislav Krapivnik. And hopefully he'll come back anytime. And good luck and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, here we go.
Hopefully, a better internet connection.
Hopefully. All right, ending recording. Okay.